This podcast was recorded at 9 a.m. on 5 July Jakarta time. Things may have changed by the time you hear this. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to Reformasi Dispatch. I'm Jeff Hutton. I'm the regional correspondent for the Straits Times of Singapore.
And I'm Kevin O'Rourke from the Reformasi Weekly service on Indonesian politics and policymaking.
If we had a bigger budget, we would use that song from REM's "The End of the World," because that's sort of how it feels. Kevin, how are you?
Yeah, we're really nowhere near that budget, actually. Oh, you mean how does it feel about the pandemic? Yeah, it's bad. Things are dire.
Things are dire. We've actually decamped to Bali, so my husband is fielding multiple conference calls in the other room. He works for one of the big banks, and they're all making sure that their people are safe. They've had multiple positive results, so they have to make sure that they're all being quarantined and have access to oxygen. It's all hands on deck for them. So I don't know if you might be able to hear that. The other thing is that what has not come to a stop is construction. So apologies to Reformasi Dispatch listeners. You might hear some hammering next door. There's a villa that's going up. Regardless, the world may be ending. Well, we will use that as an entree into COVID. There might be signs of slowing acceleration of the spread of COVID. Cases are rising, albeit at a slightly slower rate, but it's still double digits. It's still pretty bad.
Yeah, and Jakarta in particular is actually still recording pretty significant increases. The latest number was more than 10,000 cases on 4 July. So the curve in Jakarta province, which is the worst hit, has flattened a little bit just in the past 4 days, but it's still definitely rising. And nationwide, there's new records being set every day, 27,000 cases yesterday. There's, again, maybe a slight slowing, but really overwhelming the system. For example, in Jakarta, at the beginning of the pandemic, the authorities set up the Wisma Athlete Emergency Hospital, which is a complex of towers for athletes, and they converted that into an emergency hospital. An isolation ward, and its total capacity is 8,000 people. And sort of a benchmark throughout the pandemic has been how much of that is full, and is it going up or is it going down? So Jakarta now is having, as I mentioned, 10,000 cases a day. So every day the new cases are more than the entire capacity of the Wisma Athlete facility. As to put things in perspective. So people are having to isolate at home, and then that's causing more family clusters. And there's also data about numbers of deaths discovered among people isolating at home. Those range up near 300 over the past 2 weeks. Those are just the ones that are known about. The official daily death toll is again setting records. So yesterday that reached 555 in one day. I think on an international basis, Indonesia is I think about the third worst worldwide after Brazil and India. And so roughly on par with Colombia and Russia right now in terms of total national cases detected per day. Of course, on a per capita basis, there's a lot of places that are worse around the world right now. So, but if you look at Jakarta province on a per capita basis, Jakarta would be one of the worst places in the world, I think, for sure right now.
Yeah, one of the worst places in the world to be, and doubly so if you don't have the means to isolate. If you are sick, even more so.
Yeah, I mean, there's really sort of heart-wrenching videos that circulate on TikTok and so on about conditions in hospitals. There was one I saw from a hospital in Pemalang, which is a small town on the north coast of Central Java. Central Java is particularly hard-hit province, and that was a classic scene of emergency tents strewn throughout the parking lot, all full, everybody using oxygen canisters, and people ill in vehicles arriving at the hospital constantly. The whole emergency ward and the front lobby converted into COVID wards. That's That's the case in a lot of places around the country right now, especially in Central Java and West Java. Bekasi, the suburb of Jakarta in West Java, is very badly hit. There's all sorts of pretty severe reports from there. The other problem is that the testing is not really ramping up commensurately with the case detection. So the positivity rate nationwide has crept right up to about 27% now. And then that's really getting into territory where it casts doubt on the accuracy of the overall numbers and it casts doubt on the real direction of trends for the epidemic nationwide.
How does it cast doubt? And that getting positivity rates of 27, 30%, then you're obviously not testing enough?
Well, you're not capturing enough, as it implies that if you were to do another 10 tests, you would find another 3 cases. So you really just need to keep on conducting tests until each additional batch of tests produces a very marginal return of detections. So when the positivity is really high like that, there's obviously a lot of cases circulating out there that are going undetected.
This is all Delta variant, right? I have to recommend to Reformasi Dispatch listeners to have a look at this week's Economist. There's a really good write-up about how this variant is different from the previous incarnations and just sort of like the actual workings of the virus. The one thing that really stood out to me was the replication rate, where one person infected with the virus on average infects 8 other people, whereas in the past it's been a little more than 2. And that just says that the virus is far more contagious, but then it's hitting people who are less likely to combat it. Like you might have comorbidities. It doesn't necessarily mean that the virus itself is more potent or more lethal. It's just that it's hitting so many other people, that it's hitting people with diabetes, it's hitting people who who are overweight and are just lack the ability to address it, to fight it, to quarantine, and to get access to treatment. So it's far more infectious.
Yeah, it's hard to avoid, and I think it's very easy to catch. Just an exposure just for a few seconds, I think, can actually cause an infection.
Did you read it?
No, so I'm sort of asking you.
Yeah, well, that's it. It takes much less exposure to it, and then you catch it. Although symptoms are a little bit more like the cold. It's not the cold; it's a coronavirus, but because it's just being spread to so many more people who may not be able to fight it, that's where we're running into trouble.
And it's infecting children too, I think.
And children, yeah, that's the other thing too. What of the vaccine rollout? The Joko administration has said that they're going to start vaccinating children over the age of 12.
Right. So I guess that's the Delta variant is susceptible to vaccines still, at least some of the more well researched and tested vaccines like the Pfizer and Moderna, and also the J&J works against Delta. So it's not the end of the human race. There's still hope, but it's just a matter of rolling out the vaccinations. And for Indonesia, that's always just been a supply constraint problem. But there is more news now about supplies coming from the U.S. In addition to the Pfizer shipment is due starting in August, 50 million through the end of the year. There's also going to be a shipment of several million Moderna doses due imminently directly from the U.S. government. And that's news that came from a discussion between Indonesia's foreign minister and State Department officials in the U.S. The government's trying to roll out the coronavac vaccinations, including to children. The authorities have approved the use of coronavac for those aged 12 to 17. But again, the problem is just the supply and getting access to it.
But isn't there a concern that the Chinese vaccines are not effective? There's all these reports of doctors getting sick and needing to be hospitalized despite being vaccinated.
Yeah, I think the operating theory right now, in the absence of any hard evidence from anybody, is that the coronavac works to really diminish the likelihood of death or even severe illness. but it is definitely possible to get a COVID infection despite being vaccinated with CoronaVac, that's for sure, because there's hundreds of fully vaccinated Indonesian health workers all around the country who are testing COVID positive despite having been vaccinated.
What is your outlook then for the rest of the year? I mean, just talking with you here, reading the news and just the world around me, it kind of feels a bit like New York in April 2020 or India a month ago. This feels like we are starting something that could get very bad. Or do you think that there's some light at the end of the tunnel? And in fact, it's not a train coming right at us.
I honestly don't know. Yeah, I mean, it could go either way for sure. I mean, the population density is such on Java that it's really hard for people to isolate. And this variant, as you mentioned, is so contagious, and the vaccinations are still too low. So there is a possibility for this outbreak to worsen further, actually, unfortunately, because the data shows that on a per capita basis, Indonesia's levels still are short of what other countries have experienced lately, including Malaysia, but also India, Brazil, Colombia. So unfortunately, it could get worse. Maybe Jakarta could turn a corner before others, because vaccination rates are quite a bit higher in the capital than elsewhere. And it's also a relatively small province, actually, compared to the other ones on Java. That's possible for the capital, at least. But the prospects for Central Java and West Java, and especially East Java, are looking pretty grim at the moment, actually.
There's 27,000 new cases a day. Can you put that into context for a country? I mean, that's, help me with math, 27,000. I should be able to do that. It's several orders of magnitude less than the entire population, 270 million. I mean, should we be relative? Or, I mean, this can explode in exponential rates, right? The rates of infection.
Yeah, well, I mean, for example, Malaysia reached a peak of 9,000 cases a day there. And that's a country that's 1/10 the size of Indonesia, roughly. So that would imply that Indonesia could reach 90 or 100,000 cases a day if it has an epidemic on the same magnitude as Malaysia's. So it still could get an awful lot worse, actually. And the problem really is that the lack of isolation facilities could create a surge on top of a surge, as it's just becomes impossible to isolate cases, and therefore the transmissions just stay high.
On a lighter note, I don't know if you saw this, but there was some viral video my husband showed me. There's something called bear milk, and it is this canned, sweetened, condensed milk that Indonesians give to their children. It's thought to, bolster immunity, and is good for, bright eyes and shiny coat. I don't know, but it's kids drink it, and it's part of a healthy, balanced diet. There's some video doing the rounds of hordes of people rushing into a supermarket shortly after, I think probably over the weekend, in order to buy pallets of this stuff. I think. Do you know what I'm talking about? This bear milk, the cans of Bear brand milk. Yeah.
Oh yeah, sure, yeah. It's kind of like, is it baby formula or is it for older kids?
No, it's actually for. They were passing it out on the plane on the way to Bali.
Yeah,
It's believed to have medicinal properties.
okay. Yeah, driving around this weekend, the apotheques and the pharmacies are mobbed. That was really obvious. Every apotheke or every pharmacy around the city had queues to get in, and packed parking lots and so on. People are trying to stock up on various kinds of medicines. And there's a big controversy over ivermectin, this anti-parasitic medicine that's believed to be a miracle cure, and several ministers have been promoting it, much to the chagrin of the food and drug regulators, who say that it's dangerous to self-medicate with unproven medicines.
It's Luhut's hydroxychloroquine.
Yeah, it's really remarkable how different politicians have been promoting different miracle cures, and not just in Indonesia, but President Trump did this for that matter last year. But in this case, it was Eric Thohir, the state enterprise minister initially, and then especially the chief of staff for the president, Muldoko, who personally actually sent 2,500 doses to a hospital in East Java. And this is a treatment that's not proven. It could work. Some tests in some locations have provided some promising evidence, but there's lots of different questions about the dosage and the regimen. And meanwhile, prescription drugs are just it's just a bare difference between a drug and a poison. Drugs are basically poisons, and they're just applied in a way to prevent you from dying and able to help you. And so medicating on your own with an unproven prescription drug is dangerous. And the problem is ivermectin is also used for animals. And so there's cases of people becoming extremely ill from taking ivermectin that's meant for horses.
So there is a version of this anti-parasite medicine that's for horses, or it is medicine for horses and people are taking it?
There's two different ivermectins, one for humans, one for horses. The problem is that in Indonesia, it's always been possible to get prescription drugs over the counter pretty easily.
Yeah.
And so the authorities have gone into the factory that produces this in Indonesia and basically just taken over control of the factory to prevent any more shipments leaving on any trucks. So to their credit, the BPOM, the Food and Drug Agency, is doing a good job of trying to assert control over the situation.
Who's the head of the BPOM? She's been something of a star, right?
Yeah, she's really emerged as quite a star. That's Penny Lukito, and she was
Penny Lupito.
Lukito, that's somebody who nobody had ever heard about because it's a kind of an obscure bureaucratic position under normal times, but she has quite a bit of independence, actually, and so she has shown a lot of tenacity in asserting her authority, and she's gone toe-to-toe with some really major political figures, including the former health minister, Terawan Putranto, and now Muldoko.
Well, so she's doing 10 rounds with Muldoko, former, still, insider, Terawan, former minister, and presumably also Luhut. That's a tough lady. All right, let's leave the COVID talk there. I'm sure there'll be more to come. Let's talk about, let's do a little bit of a governance roundup. I thought we'd start with our friend Eddie Prabowo, the former fisheries minister who has been done in for illegally, taking kickbacks for distributing export licenses. But he will only get 5 years. Prosecutors are only asking for 5 years. That sounds pretty light.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of criticism now of the KPK because this is the KPK prosecutors who came out with these charges against him, and they're seeking a sentence which is about half of what ministers had tended to receive under the previous KPK prior to late 2019. And this is the Garindra figure, confidant of Prabowo Subianto, who immediately arranged a complex rent-seeking scheme on the exports of lobster spawn as soon as he entered the cabinet last year. So it's it kind of reflects conditions in the KPK and indicates that the commission, now that it has purged a lot of its most prominent and accomplished figures, is going to be a lot more lenient on corruption.
So, just for a bit of context and explanation, lobster spawn are basically baby lobster, and they are taken. They take the mothers, and the mothers give birth to the spawn, and the spawn are exported to mainly Asian markets, right? And it's just a cheap way of exporting lobster, and then those spawn are fattened in the export markets, right? And it's probably one of the first things that the former fisheries minister Ibu Susi Pujiastuti, banned. That was like one of the very first things that she did. And the reason for that was that lobster, lobster fishing, I don't actually think it's called fishing. When you take the lobster out of the water and sell it, that's fairly lucrative, and it's small. You can do it pretty close to shore, and it's very good for individual actors. That's how they make a living. But when you take the mothers out of the ocean, you take away their ability to restock. It is just so pernicious. It's just so ruinous to the environment, and it really has detrimental effect detrimental effect on the very poorest of fishermen.
Spoken like a true Canadian.
Did I say about? What are you talking about?
Canada, and I mean, you're from Canada, and I'm basically from Maine. So yeah, we could talk about lobsters for a long time. I think probably
all day. Yeah. So yeah, just as a bit of context, I think one of the very first acts of the previous fisheries minister, Ibu Susi Pujiastuti, she banned the practice of exporting this lobster spawn. And what these lobster spawn are, if you know anything about lobster, is that they're baby lobster. But they don't take them from the ocean. They take the mothers from the ocean, and the mothers give birth to the spawn. So when you're taking the reproducing females and then exporting the spawn to be fattened up in export markets like Vietnam or China, basically you are robbing the ocean, the environment, of its ability to replenish itself. And who does that affect? But the small scale fishermen. I don't think they're actually called fishermen because lobsters aren't fish, but because just of the very nature of how you go out to get lobster in Indonesia, you can go out as an individual on basically an inner tube, and you basically jig all night. You are taking the lobster all night using a flashlight, and you can get a few kilos and sell them at market. You don't need a boat. You don't need a lot of equipment. You just need a lot of guts. It is hard work. I've been out to those fishermen and talked to them after a night of fishing, and they're just absolutely shattered. It is hard work, but you get a few kilos and you get enough you can make a decent living. But this guy, if alleged corrupter, is robbing the livelihoods of small scale fishermen. I think if it's true, allegedly, it's absolutely disgusting, and they ought to throw the book at him.
Well, you're Canadian, so you take these things very seriously when it comes to lobsters.
The lobster, man, and cod. Don't get me started about the cod.
Yeah, right. And I'm sort of from Maine, so you and I could talk about lobsters a lot for sure. But no, in Maine, I know that the last thing anybody would ever do is take a pregnant female out of the ocean. I mean, that's of all the different crimes you can perpetrate in Maine, and there's a lot that you can perpetrate. That one is probably the worst of all that no one would ever consider doing, because it's well known that one pregnant female lobster produces, I think, several 100,000 spawn. And they drift right over the ocean. There's only a tiny percentage that actually grow into lobsters, and the role of the egg-laying female is absolutely critical for the entire lobster population and food chain. And it's interesting, the politicians here really overlooked that. And in fact, Prabowo Subianto's niece, who was a former Garindra parliamentarian, that's Saraswati Jojo Hadikusumo, she commented on this because she had a share in one of these newly constructed companies that had a quota to export these things to Vietnam. And when asked last year about this, she said there's hundreds of thousands of lobster spawn never grow into lobsters, so there's a waste. So that's wasted. So that's why we're doing this, and taking these females into captivity and then cultivating their spawn. So it just shows an ignorance of basic nature, and it's a terrible racket. And what the minister did was basically give quotas to these fly-by-night companies that supposedly were lobster producers. And then he also required them to export all their spawn through one company. And his entourage basically controlled the shares in that company, and it charged 3 times the normal freight rate for shipping these things abroad, and they all went to Vietnam because Vietnam is a country that's actually cultivating lobster and performing mariculture. They're actually performing breakthroughs in techniques, and then they in turn supply China, where these tropical lobsters are very popular.
Right. Well, this isn't just a case of kickbacks. They're robbing livelihoods of potentially millions of people along the coast. And when you go to visit these coastal fishing villages, you really feel for them because they're out there all night and it can be pouring with rain. And it doesn't matter. It is really hard work. Anyway, enough of that. Let's move on to our another little governance. Another point of governance is the Omnibus bill has held up in court.
Yeah. So this is the first of what will undoubtedly be numerous legal challenges against the 2020 Job Creation Omnibus Law. And it's interesting what happened in this case in the 9-member Constitutional Court is that the justices unanimously dismissed a suit that came from the Indonesian Worker Welfare Union Confederation, the KSBSI. And they did so because the head of the confederation passed away about 3 months ago. And the confederation has bylaws stating that its representative is its chair. And so therefore the justices refused to hear its suit because its chair was no longer with them. And the Confederation wanted its Secretary General to be the plaintiff in the suit in place of the deceased chair. But the justices refused to do that, citing the Confederation's own bylaws on the matter. So I think that the justices took a pretty strict stance in that case. And I think, they could have decided to hear the case if they had wanted to. So it sort of indicates that they don't want to hear it. What this suit was trying to do was challenge aspects of the law regarding fixed-term contracts and job severance procedures, sort of things that are at the heart of the labor market reforms that are in turn the crux of the omnibus law itself. It's a good initial indicator actually for the survivability of the law, which is important for attracting investment and creating jobs. So it still remains to be seen though how other suits will fare because there's at least a few more that will be coming forward in the Constitutional Court during the course of this year.
So the Constitutional Court is basically just finding any excuse to knock it back, even a technicality. We don't want this. Get out of here.
Well, yeah, that's one way to look at it. That is kind of what it looks like in this first case anyway. And, this context or background, the president awarded meritorious service medals to 6 of the active justices, which is sort of poor form. You're not supposed to give a meritorious service award for somebody who's still active and performing the service. That really very much looked like a bit of a quid pro quo there. The president clearly wants these justices to defend his law. And the president also revised the Constitutional Court law last year in order to extend the retirement age for the Chief Justice, which the Chief Justice was presumably very grateful for, and made a few other changes that the justices appreciated. So, I think that was part of Widodo-style lobbying that happens around these types of issues.
And speaking of Joko Widodo, he is not one who can take a joke. He, especially if he is alleged by students to be the king of lip service. Criticism is okay, but when you make fun of me, not so good. It was a fairly clever bit of satire, that alleging University of Indonesia's university students made a satirical video. President Joko Widodo, the king of lip service, he says one thing but does another. I think a completely fair charge, but one that landed them in some hot water.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, it was an interesting little vignette, actually. Basically, what it showed is that numerous aides in the president's inner circle really reacted quite badly to this meme that came out from the official student senate of Indonesia's most prestigious university, University of Indonesia. And I think the meme really struck a chord, not because not just because it accused the president of being the king of lip service, but also it had a image of Widodo wearing a ornate king's crown, and behind him was this gigantic red lipstick print, something you would see on a Rolling Stones album cover. And so it was really kind of striking visually, and I think that was mattered more than the content of the text and the meme, which pertained to the president doesn't abide by his words, basically. So these aides to the president countered and said that, no, if the students are going to do this, they need to have data and facts and argumentation and academic rigor. And so then one of the BEM spokespersons came out and listed the cases in which the president has differed from his actions, like the KPK. He said that the personnel of the KPK will have job security, and in fact 21 are losing their jobs. And then he cited another reason as well. So he came right back with the argumentation that they asked for. So that was good to see. But then what happened is that there was a big backlash because, first these students at BEM, the student that's called the Student Senate is BEM, they had to be dragged into the university administrators and presumably chewed out, I guess. And then they suffered cyber attacks on their social media accounts. There was an Insta story about this whole affair that Instagram restricted. And then finally, there was a national outcry from political opponents, University of Indonesia alumni groups denouncing the administration for allowing this to happen, and so on. And then finally, the president, 2 days later, issued a video statement on the Secretariat's YouTube channel in which he sort of begrudgingly said that students have the right of expression in a democracy, which it was good to hear, but it's kind of pathetic that that statement was ever even necessary to make in the first place.
And especially from a guy who is not embattled. I mean, his popularity remains very high given the circumstances. And someone who knows about using social media and the media in general to buttress his image. It's just, I don't know. It feels like the type of stuff, again, that happens to the guy who's been in power for too long, this sense of entitlement.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it is attributable to the people that Widodo has gathered around him. These Suharto-era generals and so on. Yeah, and there's an interesting cultural aspect here, too, because you'll hear arguments saying that Indonesia abides by what they call, quote-unquote, Eastern culture, where manners and etiquette and respecting elders matters. And maybe Widodo, I don't know, subscribes to that. But in that case, then you can sort of examine which came first. Was it the cultural etiquette was in place, and then Indonesia's long history of authoritarianism came afterwards? Or was it the authoritarianism that produced that etiquette and demand for respecting elders? The two kind of play off each other, I think. And basically, showing deference to one's superiors may seem admirable on the surface, but it also really jeopardizes democracy. And Indonesia has really fought hard to win its gains in democratization, which are so important for the country, given its authoritarian past. And that's a key job of the president, is to defend that and safeguard it. And that's really not happening.
And also maddening that he could have dealt with this with a few well-placed comments. He could have made a meme with the students. He could have, made a joke and moved on. So, yeah, it does sort of suggest he's not getting good advice.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's really not what one would have expected at the outset of the Widodo era, because this is precisely the thing where Widodo always actually performed well, was in forming rapport with constituents and using humor as well. I always think of Joko Widodo as being he's arguably one of the funniest world leaders in history. Up there with Winston Churchill and in that department. But in this case, it really definitely fell flat.
Yeah. Come on, Jokowi. Raise your game. This is not the same Jokowi of 2012. And last, is it Bye-Bye Bakri? One of the scions of Abrizel Bakri, a name I have not been hearing much of lately, has lost his bid to head up Kadin, the Indonesia Chamber of Commerce. This is one of the family's last redoubts, and Abrizel Bakri is a past candidate for president and one of Indonesia's wealthiest families. How significant is this? And is it the end of an era?
Probably not, no, but it's the suppression of an era for another Kadin term, at least, which is the next best thing. The Bakri, Abrizel Bakri himself was the chief nemesis of President Yudhoyono during the second Yudhoyono term, ostensibly an ally, but in fact a nemesis. And he's a coal tycoon who has a horrendous reputation with creditors internationally, and engaged in a real knockdown, drag-out fight with Nathaniel Rothschild in particular about a decade ago. And he had been chair of Golkar and was really instrumental in controlling parliament, and also basically forced out Sri Mulyani from the finance portfolio in 2010, ostensibly because of the Bank Century takeover, which was actually a pretty innocuous takeover overall. But really what was going on at the time was that Sri Mulyani was trying to collect coal mining royalties that major coal producers were in arrears on. And there was a lashing back from the coal tycoons, chief of which at the time was Bakri. So as you mentioned, Kadin has always been the stronghold of the family. Bakri himself had been Kadin chair, and then two of the last three Kadin chairs are former Bakri Group executives, Suryo Sulisto first, and then Rozan Roslani most recently. So now there was an election for a new Kadin chair to replace Roslani, who's going to the U.S. as ambassador to America. And the two candidates were Abrizel Bakri's elder son, Adindya Bakri, and also the Indika Energy chief director is Arshad Rashid. And the latter won against expectations. And so that was a pretty dramatic outcome, actually. And I think that the president, ministers may have intervened to bring that about.
For overseas listeners, can you give us a sense of how important Kadin is?
Right. Well, it's the chief lobbying body for domestic industries. And so it wields a fair amount of clout that way. It's very closely overlapped with Golkar, the Suharto-era ruling party, which Bakri had headed until an internal rift in 2014 really split the party apart. And then it finally came back together again in 2018 and is now under the coordinating economics minister, Erlangga Hartarto. So it's pretty critical for affecting the course of policymaking, and it's particularly critical nowadays with so many ambitions on paper, at least, to reform the energy sector and shift away from coal. So the Bakri family is their fortunes are very much tied together with coal. So instead of them heading Kadin, it's going to be Rashid. Unfortunately, he also is a coal tycoon. So in terms of policymaking, the differences between the two candidates might be rather slight. But in terms of domestic politics, this really stymies Bakri's drive to recoup their political power, for now at least.
Well, there you have it, Reformasi Dispatch listeners, a little bit of much needed Schadenfreude at a week that is sorely needed. It goes some way to making everyone feel better. No guests this week, so that's the program. Our producer is Stephen Handoko. Editing by Ivan Cristiani and Aditya Akbar. Music by the Blue Dot Sessions. For a free 1-month trial of Kevin's invaluable Reformasi Weekly newsletter, go to reformasi.info. And if you're listening to us through a podcast app, please subscribe and rate us. It helps. As always, you can reach us at hello@onthelevel.id. This podcast is a production of On the Level Media. I'm Jeff Hutton. Bye for now.